A good night of Shabbos, I share some words of Torah. This will be followed by Niggun performed by my brothers. In Parshas Yitro, today's Parsha, chapter 19, verse 19, the Pasuk says, Moshe Yedaber v'Elokim Yanenu v'Kol. When the Bnei Yisrael stood at Mount Sinai, at the time they received the Torah, Moshe would speak and God would respond with a voice. Now this verse is a little unusual because it doesn't say what Moshe said and what God responded. And indeed Rashi notes this and he explains that this, don't take it literally, it means that some of the commandments were spoken by Moshe, some was spoken by God. God made Moshe's voice very strong so that everybody could hear him. But the Alter Rebbe notes that this pasuk also tells us that there's something else going on here. It doesn't tell us what Moshe spoke and what God responded because there's another message here. Moshe Yedaber, Moshe speaks, doesn't just mean speaks, but Yedaber also has another meaning. Like the word in Psalm 47, Yad ben Amim Tachtenu. Yadber, we move the vowels around, means to lead, to subdue, the kind of leader who is able to take those whom he's leading and direct them in the right place. And when it says that Moshe Yedaber, it's not just that Moshe is speaking, but Moshe is able to subdue, to overcome, and direct, and redirect. And Alter Rebbe explains what that means. We know that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov studied Torah. They were aware of the mitzvahs. But what changed at Mount Sinai when God descended and gave the Torah? What changed was that until this point, Torah was a spiritual pursuit. And now God says, I give you the Torah, and the purpose of the Torah study, the purpose of the performance of mitzvahs is to infuse the physical, material world with holiness, to reveal that God's presence is there even in material things, even in Gashmias. So that when you do a mitzvah with a physical item, that physical item and that physical space takes on a holiness because the performance of the mitzvah and the study of Torah really reveals the godly spark and the divinity that's hidden there. And that's our job in this world today. And Alter Rebbe, to illustrate this point, uses another pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, where God says, "V'lo sechalalu Hashem kodshi v'nikdashti v'soich b'nei Yisrael." Literally translated, that means do not desecrate my name. Right? It's a mitzvah. God says there's a prohibition against desecrating God's name, against chilul Hashem, and there's a mitzvah for kiddush Hashem, to sanctify God's name. And we think of the word techalalu, chilul Hashem, as desecration. But the word chilul or halal has another translation. Halal means hollow, open space. God gives us the Torah, and God tells us that now you're going to learn that there is no hollow space. There is no void, there is no vacuum. The entire universe is filled with God's presence. You, Am Yisrael, have the responsibility, now that I gave you the Torah, to reveal that there is no halal, that God is everywhere, and every interaction, and every step, and every moment of our life is about making a kiddush Hashem, which is to demonstrate that there is no halal, there is no hollow space, but that the entire universe is kodesh, it's sanctified, it's connected, and is designated for the service of Hashem. And this is really the message that's in this pasuk, Moshe Yedaber v'Elokim Yanenu v'Kol. And this is how the Alter Rebbe explains it. Moshe Yedaber, it's not just a reference to Moshe Rabbeinu. What is Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe, the Torah says, was the most humble person that ever existed. Moshe embodied humility and submission to God. As it says in Bamidbar, Parshas Haleivi, Moshe was the most humble person that ever lived. Because Moshe was the most humble and was able to submit to God, he therefore was able to do what God wanted. And when you submit to the will of God, then you're able to overcome everything else and direct that towards the service of Hashem. And so every Yid, every person has within them an element of Moshe and the ability to submit to God, and thereby realize that we have the ability to overcome all challenges and take all our faculties and all our desires and everything we do and to direct them towards the service of Hashem. So Moshe Yedaber, with the ability of Moshe within us, Moshe speaks. The word Yedaber doesn't just mean spoke in the past. The word Yedaber, Moshe speaks in the present. It also means Moshe spoke, Moshe speaks, Moshe will speak. And that's the ability of the Moshe within us, the sense to submit to the will of God, to overcome nature and to direct it towards the service of Hashem. The word Elokim, the way it's spelled out in Hebrew, the gematria is 86. Hateva, nature, The nature is also Gematria 86, the Baal Shem Tov says. And when we reveal the element of Moshe in our lives, submit to the will of God, and realize that we have the ability to subdue everything around us and direct them towards the service of Hashem, all of a sudden the nature that's around us is no longer nature. We realize that nature is just a cover, but really what's behind the nature and what supports the nature, what is nature, is God's presence. So Moshe Yadaber, Moshe speaks. The Moshe within us is able to yadber, to subdue, to overcome nature, and to direct it to a service of Hashem. To reveal Elokim Ya'anenu, and Elokim responds. All of a sudden, our response to our submission to the will of God is the revelation that the divine really is nature, that there is nothing but for God's presence. And how do we do that? The last word of the pasuk is bekol, with the voice. A voice, again, is an expression. Through the expression of the words of Torah, through the performance of mitzvahs, through the expression of the Moshe within us, Moshe Yadaber, Moshe speaks, Moshe overcomes, Moshe Yadber. God's presence in nature is revealed, and that depends on our own kol Torah, kol tefillah, voice of Torah, voice of tefillah, the expression of action in the fulfillment of mitzvahs. May it be the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we live our lives in the way that Moshe taught us, a life of revelation, revealing that nature is God, realizing that our entire experience is about being Mekadesh Shem Shemayim, about sanctifying God's name. How do we sanctify God's name? By remembering that the V'lo Yisachalalu, that there is no void. It's all about V'nikdashti, about realizing that we're connected with God at all times. Like the word Kiddushin in marriage, where there's a connection between two entities, so too Kiddush Hashem is a connection of the Jew and the universe with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where we merit the ultimate realization of that with the coming of Mashiach immediately. We'll celebrate Shabbos, Yerushalayim, and HaKodesh. Good Shabbos, and now for a Niggun.